while I was, you know, I give God thanks for the opportunity to teach this class. I give God thanks for the opportunities that I have to share the information, the knowledge I have. And I usually spend time in prayer. I say, God, I always say, Lord God, please open up my mind. Help me to be help me to be able to be a good professor, to share, open the students' knowledge and to help them to get what they need to get out of this class. And help me to be able to find the resources that could help them to continue to rediscover themselves and their world so that they can navigate it and chart it with all that's going on in the world today with Donald Trump and how he's renegotiating. Well, when he was president in 2016, he renegotiated NAFTA. NAFTA is a very important um agreement. NAFTA is a very important agreement. When you think about it, as Caribbean people, we must understand the whole idea and concept behind NAFTA and how that has helped to derail Caribbean economy or Caribbean economies in terms of how it helped to derail our preferential banana agreement that we had with the EU. But anyways, some time ago, I said, while teaching this course some time ago, I've been learning and discovering things. And when you look at this course, when we started to look at this Caribbean thought course, at first we look at the syllabus and we look at even Caribbean studies and the information that students are exposed to. And when you look at history and how we teach and expose students to history within Caribbean, it is one that begins with slavery. One that begins with a defeatist position. One that was oppressive or is oppressive. You do not talk about 664 BC. You don't hear about African kings and kingdoms. But this is quite interesting. But so then, as we start teaching the course, when you look at the syllabus, we look at currents that have come to shape the Caribbean since colonization. Since colonization. But then, as we start to, one of the things we ask academics to do and professors to do is to continue to read, continue to write, continue to do research. That's our responsibility to our students. And so I continue to do research. And so I came across a book recently entitled They Came Before Columbus. They Came Before Columbus. And I think I put it in the WhatsApp group. You guys must have saw it. They came before us. They came before Columbus. The African presence in ancient America by Ivan van Sertima. This book was written in 1975, and it is a book that uses history and linguistics to demonstrate and to prove the African presence, Africa's presence before Columbus arrived in a very significant way. In fact, before Columbus came to the New World, they were actively trading along Africa shorelines. They were in Africa trading. The fact that they were in Africa trading would suggest that Africans were skilled tradesmen, merchants, had valuables and not only that, information. They had information because now we're learning that writing was in Africa before it got to Europe. So they were writing and reading and discovering and learning. And the Africans were going to Europe. The Africans were going to the West Indies. and coming back. And the Europeans were then in Africa trading and information. And of course, by doing so, they would have learned of the Caribbean. They would have learned of the West Indies, because Columbus was already in 1490 in 1488, Columbus and Europeans were off the coast of West Africa, actively trading in Africa. And the Africans were already coming to the Caribbean. And they learned of East Indies, and they learned of the West Indies. And they went back to Europe and went to Queen Victoria and negotiate and asked for better ships and more ships to be able to penetrate into the West Indies and the East Indies. And when they got there, they called it a discovery, demonstrating white chauvinist mentality. If white people didn't discover it, it is not discovered. If the religion is not white, it is no religion. In fact, just recently, we learned that they dug up some the 18th dynasty, some kings from the 18th dynasty. And in a lecture, 2 weeks from today, I'm going to have a lecture. It's going to be entitled "The Black Kings of the 25th Dynasty," and I'm going to share with you some artifacts, okay, and talk about the 25th dynasty, okay, because this is important, because I want you to understand that the African heritage has been bastardized. The African heritage has been bastardized. And the idea of memory is important. If, as academics and psychologists and social workers and theologians and pastors, memory is important. Imagery is important. And we talk about reimagining. When we talk about people, young men and young women, the idea of memory. When we talk about our history, the idea of memory. The memory of the white man, the memory of the black man, the memory of the brown man, the imaging of the black man, the imaging of the white man. Is it one for the black? Fanon says the Negro is not any more than the white man. Frantz Fanon in Black Skins, White Man says the Negro is not any more than the white man, in a very beautiful, succinct way, demonstrating the reality of society of the 1960s and the history within which we find ourselves. So this is very, so he says, when he says that he's in that reading, he says, in other words, what is he saying? He says the black man is trapped. The black man in the Americas, in the New World, in the Western civilization today, is the black man is trapped in his inferiority. And he's predisposed to think in those ways. Even when he thinks that he is not, he is. Because the yardstick for him is our ability to be able to embrace and to internalize and to simulate Western ideology and Western culture. As against the black man who is trapped. So the black man is trapped in his inferiority, while the white man is trapped in to think he's always superior. and must act in certain ways and commit suicide or violence if he feels as though he cannot assert his dominance and his superiority. He cannot be upstaged by the other. If he is upstaged by the other, they throw a tantrum. They burn down Black Wall Street as they did in 1921. Or they send their CIAs and agents to penetrate. Or they launch a Project 2025, like what they're doing now. Or entertain a government of populism like that they have never had before, starting in 2016. Countries we now are adopting a populist movement across the world. Nevertheless, and I said to people, segregation was not bad. But then they realized anytime black people were separated and worked together, it created a problem. All of a sudden, they started to develop wealth that starts to rival the status quo, like Black Wall Street in Maryland, or in Levittown, and so on and so forth, or in the Caribbean. It's a problem that Jamaica and some of these Caribbean islands getting money from China and modernizing. The idea of structural adjustment to create debt was always to continue to maintain a dominance over the satellite countries dominated by black and brown people. They are never to overtake the superpower. The international arrangement that goes on within this neoliberal framework was always existed since 1944 and even before that. So Panama, now all of a sudden, Caribbean thought must now talk about international politics and US politics, because now Donald Trump has an interest in the Caribbean relationship with China and what's going on in Panama. Now we must talk about that. Nevertheless, it is important to understand that the idea of memory is important, because children and adults and people are going around thinking as if black people and Africans and black and brown people don't come from our heritage. We cannot foresee a heritage. 5,000, 50,000 years ago, one of sophistication and civilization. They call it primitive. It was not primitive. We were called primitive so that it was part of the strategy and the plan to wipe out any benefit, any value that come from the black man, so that their theft, so that they can maintain what they have stolen. The artifacts and the archives and the wealth and the lands and the discoveries and the contributions to life and society is shrouded in conspiracy and lie. But it is those who are speaking, those who are presenting critical evidence of a history that has been corrupted. They are the ones who are called conspiracy theorists. And now they are passing laws to prevent critical thinking. And that continues to dilute education. I was reading the book. This is going to be for the lecture next week, because I don't think after I finished with today's lecture, I won't have time to get into, well, I don't think I won't have time to get into this particular lecture, looking at the idea of looking at this book. I want us to delve into this book and also begin to start looking at neoliberalism And some of the declarations I make in the neoliberalism, looking at the 1960s and the 1970s, and how what happened in the 1960s, then by the 1970s we have OPEC and the oil crisis and the WTO and the IMF, and how that create and how the WTO and the post-industrial countries, how they create, how they plan to continue to maintain their dominance, how that has, it is very important for us to understand the framework, the strategy that, and I said, when I'm at Georgetown, I study strategy. And as a people, we must always study strategy. We must be strategic. Now, the relationship that China and some of the Caribbean and the global South countries are embarking on with China, it must be one that involves strategy. What is that strategy? I don't know. We don't know. We don't know if there a strategy that is that. What is the strategy? What is the Caribbean? What is Caribbean government strategy? To develop competitiveness, to develop advantages, to develop their society so that they are able to overcome the challenge of their vulnerability, their position, their geographic positioning in their world and their histories. And okay, and also the superpowers of China, Russia, and the US, and by extension Europe. That no, these are the questions we must ask ourselves. But anyways, this book is quite powerful. The book written by Ivan van Sertima, which is quite interesting. That why is it that I don't see these books in Jamaica? What is going on? This book was written in 1975, and he is talking about a study that they had uncovered from the 1970s and before. Why we don't see these books in Jamaica? Huh? Why is it that we don't see books like in the libraries and stuff? The Social Origins of Democratic Socialism in Jamaica by Nelson W. Keith and Novella Z. Keith. It is so hard to get these books. Why? I notice, is there a conspiracy going on? What is going on? These very vital books. I don't this Now let me ask you guys, have you heard of this book? They came before Columbus by the African presence in ancient America. Have you guys heard of that book?
Not me.
Mm, mm, interesting. That's what I'm talking about. Um I want to share my screen. Hopefully this is the right screen. No, it's not the right screen. I Have you guys gotten a chance to go on JTS online? Okay, yeah. Somebody had their hand up, please. Who had their hand up? Go ahead. Who Someone had their hand up. This book, they came before us by Ivan Van Setima. The book uses historical theories, research, and cultural similarities between the early Africans, first America. Let me tell you, before I discovered this book, I wrote an article saying, "Have we misunderstood our heritage?" Because there's something other, apart from the idea that Africans came to the Caribbean. About a year or 2 years ago, I had the Urban Indian Heritage Society. One of my good friends, I'm part of a fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. And one of my dean, my fraternity, my good brothers, Dr. Nolan Fontaine, who lives here in Philadelphia, who's been to the class. He's the chairman and the founder of Urban Indian Heritage Society, is embarking on a project. And there's also a petition. Kyrie Irving is also now supporting the group. And there is this big thing talking about how we have been misclassified, how black people, many people have been misclassified and there's a petition and so on. Um, and I've written an article in the Gleaner. You can check it out in the letters. And I think hopefully I get a chance to share it if I have time. The question is, have we misunderstood our heritage? I think I should have. If I have time, I'll share that today. I'll share that article and I'll discuss some of the findings, some of the other ideas surrounding that. about the whole idea of misunderstanding heritage, because we talked about the Urban Indian Heritage Society is saying that many black and brown people, even from Jamaica, they have conducted study in Jamaica. They're saying that many black and brown people there, many of them are more closely connected to the original people that were living in the Caribbean, living on the island, to the Taino people. That is interesting. But the thing is, the data and the study that we have that conducts tests. Now they have a study. They do. And by the way, if you guys are interested to doing what they and your DNA or knowing about your ancestry and your roots, you can go to ancestry.com. But you can also go to one that's more rootsy, the Urban Indian Heritage Society. UIHS.org. And if you want me to invite them to the class and do a presentation, fine, I will. If we do a vote and you say, hey, I'm going to have a vote, say, do you guys want us to invite the Urban Indian Heritage Society to come to the class? Then I will ask them to come to the class and they'll do a presentation about about this whole thing about heritage, about Jamaican heritage, Caribbean heritage, America's people heritage, black people heritage, and how many they're saying, the assumption is that that they're saying that many black people from these parts of the world are more closely connected to the Taino people, to the people here, to the Caribbean people that were already living here. It's quite interesting. People had scoffed at that. But if we were exposed to books like this, if we were exposed to books they came before Columbus, and so as I thought about it, I said, first of all, when Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean, sorry, before Christopher Columbus, yeah, when Christopher Columbus came to the Caribbean and to the Americas, he did not, this language is important. He did not discover the Caribbean, but he discovered it because remember, the Eurocentric or Eurocentrism is about essentialism. Okay, Eurocentrism promotes a worldview. That's okay. It's coaching a worldview that says there's only one way of seeing the world, and if it is not blessed, baptized, or created, so and if you look at the map of the world, the European map of the world never had the Americas and the West Indies, the Caribbean. It wasn't until Christopher Columbus. So Christopher Columbus was said to have discovered it because we live in the Western world. And when you are in Rome, you live in the Romans do. And, we talk about American exceptionalism and white racism and supremacy and dominance and the purity of the Aryan race and what Hitler was doing and what Russia is trying to do now and what people is thinking that Project 2025 and Donald Trump is trying to do not only in the US but in the world, because they're saying that J.D. Vance, the vice president of the US, is traveling all over Europe and all over the world promoting their mission of making the Puritan white Anglo-Saxon race the dominant race again, because the white race is in decline. Nevertheless, this book is quite powerful. This book looks at, and so as I said to you, I thought about it. The Urban Indian Heritage Society, people thought that they were crazy, but they embarked on research, saying that people are, and then I usually ask the students in the class, and you guys are going to get to do this. The next homework you do, you get to go to your homes, go to your communities, and find out if you know anything about your history. How far back can you go? Why can't you go far back? Are there any American Indian any American I'm sorry, any Indians in your family? Um, from the Taino people, from the Arawakan tribes. How far back can you go? Or, I mean, they might very well be African heritage, but this is quite interesting. And of course, I had another gentleman who will come to the class probably 3 weeks, 4 weeks from now, talking about there's something about Caribbean people. Caribbean people are the original Israelites. They aren't even African. A Roman general gave Africa the name Africa. They aren't. That's another perspective, and there's a group of Israelites and a black Israelite here in Philadelphia. Quite powerful. Yes, go ahead, Abriel Ellis. Go ahead.
Afternoon, everybody. Sir, it's very interesting that you touch on that topic because that is something that I also agree with as it relates to us being more closely related to the peoples that were here first and then to the Africans. I remember when I was in high school, some persons came to my school and they said that the Maroons, they were talking about the Maroons, and they were saying that the reason why they had to make a treaty with the Maroons is because they came and saw them there. So they had to make a treaty with them because they were there originally. I know that people have varying views on that as to whether they came and saw the Maroons or not, but that was the view that they presented to us at school, and
And
it
yeah, and
was
then this
very
is and
interesting.
that yeah, and then where the Maroons? Okay, fine. There we have the Maroons, and who are the Maroons? The Maroons they say are Africans. Sorry, are people that were slaves that escaped when the British came. When Europe was warring in 1655. In 1655, that war, and when the British came, this many of the Spanish, they said that the Spanish freed the slaves, or Spanish freed the slaves that were there. But who are these slaves that the Spanish had?
But sir, remember you
Well,
told
who are
us
they? They were
in a
not
session
African slaves, They were people that were there in the land already. The Taino people that were already living there. But some of the very Taino people that were living there were already mixed up with African blood, because Africans were there coming to. And next week, when we start delving into this book, you're gonna see some artifacts and the music. You see how, and then some Africans are saying, "Wow, Caribbean people music is quite interesting. We don't even play our second beat like that." Oh my God, this is powerful. Let me tell you guys. We will delve. This is just whetting the appetite, because this is really a undergraduate second level 200 level course. Um, so I can't even go deep. I want to go deeper and do more, but I'm limited by what I can share, because I don't want to blow your mind too much. And get away from the course. But but one of the things I want to say is very important to. I mean, the way when you look at how information has been hidden from us, which is quite unfortunate. But there is document, and what is Chantal or some students will say, so where can we find information about all of this? And I took your professor took it upon himself. I was already doing my doctorate and part of the faculty at Georgetown, and I took it upon myself to go to Temple University to do a PhD, so I could get in Afro College to get some to understand the idea of the Afrocentric paradigm, and how and the preeminence of an African civilization that predates Western civilization, so that we can now start to create a memory of Africa, not one that is defeatist, but one that has birthed civilization to the world. The black man can hold out him chest with sophistication. But but there is some of you, I hope you guys rewatched the class last week, watch some of the videos that I had, some powerful videos about how they have gone to try to hide the history, how they try to hide history, they try to sell the story, they try to read. No, when I talk about, I'm going to define how power works, and in colonization, how they try to redefine a thing. That's how they try to demean. Okay, they try to justify. They try to redefine you, what you are not. Kaiga God said, "Once you label me, you negate me." They try to redefine you and then to dominate you. They say black people don't have no religion because at the time when you have religion, it means you are a human. They said they were primitive. They did not invent anything. They were property. And then they went as far as to wipe out any trace of history that would suggest otherwise. Or they try to. And so this is so I wrote in the margins of this book. I wrote in the margins of this book. In the margins of this book, they came before us, before Columbus, the African presence in ancient America, Ivan Van Sertima. And guess what? This guy is from Guyana. So I did not commit a crime. When you say, okay, why are you going outside of Caribbean thought, Caribbean studies, or the Afrocentric paradigm? Why are you bringing another? No, I'm sticking within the subaltern, sticking within history from below, I'm using, who is Ivan Van Sertima? Oh my God, I'm gonna play a video. Next week class, it's gonna be all this book. But I already start talking about it. But Ivan is from Guyana. That's it. I'll stop right there. And if anybody's doing Guyana, maybe you should throw away who you are doing and try and investigate Guyana. Although he never lived he's from Guyana, but he spent most of his days in the US or in London. But I asked the question, have we misunderstood our history? How we misunderstood our heritage? So the first thing, there are two ways we have misunderstood our heritage and our history. One, the misclassification, thinking that we are all from Africa, without thinking that um, from a defeated Africa, from we are all okay, um, cultivating a mind. So now we're talking about we have to now reimagine our history, so that our black boys and girls and our people can think of in a victorious way than in an oppressive way. Okay, I remember when you go into certain communities and some brown skin or white people come into some communities, look at them with awe, because in our minds, in the memories, in our attitudes, in our predilections, it is entrenched in us. But now when we think about our history, that we are not people who come from privilege. We are people who are overtaken by theft. That's a good starting point to begin our Caribbean history and the history of man and the history of ourselves. The introduction of the book, They Came Before Columbus, it says 6 years ago, during my first brief visit to America, I came across 3 volumes in the private library of a Princeton professor. Private library. These things should be public, but they were private. They had been published half a century ago, and their title fascinated me. The title was Africa and the Discovery of America. They represented a lifetime of dedicated scholarship by a Harvard linguist whose name was Leo Wiener. Professor Wiener had been working on a grammar of American languages in the early years of this century when he stumbled upon a body of linguistic phenomena that indicated clearly to him the presence of an African and Arabic influence on some medieval Mexican and South American languages before the European contact. Before the European contact period. As I say, I was fascinated by the subject. And as he was fascinated by it, so was I in 2021 and 2025. Documentary evidence. And he found it in the private library of the professor. Private library of the professor. And he said 6 years ago, during my first feat, and this book was written in 1975. So this could be, he discovered it probably 1950s. And what he discovered was published half a century ago. That's 50 years ago. So people knew this. People knew that Africans were coming to the Caribbean and discovered the New World long before the European, and they never said anything about it. They kept it in the dark. Just as though, okay, one, that's the first thing they kept in the dark. And they also kept in the dark the fact that Africa invented and gave the world civilization and writing and the pyramids of man. They never talk the fact that the Egypt was the land of Kemet that is Africa today. They never talked about, and now you're seeing, I can't wait to show you these artifacts. For next week class, we'll do this. I'm going to stop. The Black Kings of the 12th, 5th dynasty. And so we talked about, this is important that we start to think about our beginning within the Caribbean. Where do we begin? Do we begin in a defeatist way? Yes, Gabriel. Go ahead, Gabriel. Gabriel, go ahead. Chantal, go ahead.
Good afternoon. You stated that the colonizers would essentially hide the fact that Africans were the first set to explore what we now consider to be the Caribbean. Is there any evidence or solid proof of that I could find somewhere to make notes on?
That's what I've been talking about, yes. The book, they came before Columbus. The African presence in ancient America, and we're going to talk about this some more in next week class, and we're going to share artifacts and so on. It's if you go into JTS online, you'll see it. In fact, I'm going to share the book. You can go on Amazon. The book is on Amazon. I ordered the book on Amazon. It came in 2 days. In 2 days, the book was delivered to me.
So that particular book is a part of the reading material for this course.
Oh yes, right? And I'm going to, yes, I'll share it with you because this is powerful. You guys, and by the way, they're not doing this at UE. They don't have this at UE. Puff out your chest. Okay? They're not talking about this book by Ivan Van Sertima. And the fact that Christopher Columbus, the fact that African sailors came from Mali and these other countries to Jamaica, to the Caribbean. Okay? Very important. Yes, go ahead.
Sir, I was going to say that based on what you told us also in the last class about other persons being here before Columbus, my thought was that if we believe in the Bible and we believe that everything began with the Bible and Adam and Eve, then everything would have started in Africa. So therefore, Africans would have been the African civilization would have been the oldest, you know, civilization. So all other civilizations would have come
No,
from.
no, don't say that. Don't say that too tough. That sound like you sound like Rasta now, man. Who said that? Who talking right now?
No, but sir, if you believe
Bro,
the
is that
Bible,
you? Are you from a Rasta area or something?
no, I'm a Christian, sir, and I believe the Bible that the Bible is the word of God. And if the word of God
The
is
Rasta
true,
people them always say everything come from Jah from Africa.
but
No,
is
but
it true?
sir, hold
Africa
on,
is a
sir.
motherland, sir. Everything did come from. If God created Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve were the first set of people, and we know that the Garden of Eden was in Africa, and Eve had to have been a black woman in order to produce all the other races, then everything started from Africa, sir.
Wait. No. I mean, they don't. Is that true? Oh, wow. This is, you guys are radical. Okay, who else? Somebody, this is good. Somebody else. Yes, go ahead. Very good, though.
But
Who
the
else?
matter is, Miss Ellis, I do not agree with what you're saying in aspects of that, because at the end of the day, if you're going to say that the Africans, everything started in Africa and it must end in Africa, there is nothing in the Bible that supports that claim. If you read the Bible as you stated in Revelation, it said he saw a new Jerusalem coming out of heaven. That's not Africa, beloved. But I am not going to debate that. That's biblical. You hold where you hold, I'll hold what I hold, but I do not agree with that.
Well, some people might think that is a privileged position to say that to say that everything comes from Africa, must end with Africa. But in fact, but what Gabriel is saying is quite powerful. Is that many Africologists believe that many Africans and people and Pan Africanists and so on. That's what they believe. Everything, but many humanists don't believe that. But people who promote Afrocentric paradigm in a very radicalist way may promote that, but this is quite powerful. Let me share a paper with you guys. My presentation with you guys. You guys are not seeing it because I had, when I learned about the Afrocentric paradigm, I had some problems with it. I was very upset, but I was. Um, is this it? Let me see if is this the right thing. Let me
More
share.
questions, sir, before you carry on. Is it to be said that most of the reading material for the rest of this course is going to be Afrocentric based, right?
No, not necessarily. No, but this is a new concept to Caribbean thought that I am driving home to you guys because I don't think we have. This is something that's not being discussed in the Caribbean. This is new. This is revolutionary. This is something but this is something that when we move on in the class, this is a foundational concept to some of the things that we're going to start talking about when we start talking about um, voodoo and obia and attitudes towards Afro-Caribbean beliefs. Then and the attitudes that many people have today and where that stems from, and whether or not that is Afrocentric based on your understanding of Afrocentric, or what it is, and what it and where and what is and where are we going as Caribbean peoples for the future? How are we to conduct hold on. And how are we to conduct um yeah,
Sir, can I say something?
yeah, go ahead.
Sir, that is exactly my point. Chantal, her response in the chat when she's saying that um if you believe everything, she said something about everything not believing that everything. Oh, she read what the scripture that she read, and she was saying that that is not Africa. But sir, the point is that we have been so conditioned to believe that something as profound as that could not be the truth, because it's like people feel as if in their subconscious, even though they might not admit it, nothing great could have come from Africa or started
I
from
never said
Africa.
that, and I never implied that. You brought a biblical base, and I answered you with a biblical base. I never indicated that. I do not appreciate you thinking or implying that I said that. I never said that. Nor did I imply that. You came with a biblical background, and I answered you with a biblical background. That is all it was.
But this, based on my research, I'm not accusing you, Chantal, but based on my research, and if it came across that way, I apologize. But based on my research, the Garden of Eden was indeed in Africa, and that would have been the origin also of all life. And Eve would have had to have been a black woman in order to produce all the other races. That's a biological fact.
Okay, guys, interesting, very powerful, very powerful. This is good. I like it. But I'm going to share a video with you guys. Did you guys watch the video that I mean, the YouTube video about the assault asset society last week? Hello, guys.
I didn't, sir. I'm not sure if anyone else did, but I didn't.
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. All right. All right, I'm going to share a video, but before I share the video, the question is, the challenge is, how do we unite all Africans in a world that has made sure we remain divided? The Afrocentric paradigm rediscovers and redistributes and promotes Afrocentricity over Eurocentrism, and by extension, ethnocentrism. What is ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism is to judge other people based on your own values. To be ethnocentric, so you are ethnocentric. It is judging others based on your own values, based on what you believe is right and what you believe is wrong. That is ethnocentric. And of course, Afrocentrists will tell you, or Afrocologists, or Caribbean Pan-Africanists will tell you that Eurocentrism promotes ethnocentrism. And when you study African societies, there is a lot of ethnocentrism that's built in. Even there is this disdain among themselves, so that they would bleach their own skin. They would.
So, Sister
Yes.
Ellis, can you please fix your name, please? Because there's no Gabriel in the class. It's Natalie Ellis, right? So we're trying to take the register. Go ahead, sir.
But you have completely. I don't remember anything I was talking about. If you have to make a point, and if I'm making a point, a very important point, I would please wait until I have completed the point, unless it's an emergency. Okay.
Yes, sir. No problem, sir.
Now you have because I've forgotten the point. But anyway, the point I'm making, I was defining ethnocentrism, and I'm saying ethnocentrism. Anyways, I'll remember that. But anyways, the Afrocentric paradigm rediscovers and redistributes and promotes Afrocentricity over Eurocentrism, and by extension, ethnocentrism. To be Afrocentric is not to be ethnocentric. But the Afrocentrist will say to be Eurocentric is to be ethnocentric, unless Eurocentrism has changed. Yet, ethnocentrism was not always a central aspect of African culture. And history, as Dr. Mazama asserts, Afrocentricity stresses the importance of cultivating a consciousness. This is the most important thing that you need to understand about Afrocentricity. Afrocentricity stresses the importance of what? Cultivating a consciousness of victory as opposed to dwelling on oppression. I am here advocating for a Caribbean, if last week class, Caribbean Thought class, and I hope you guys are watching the lecture. Caribbean Thought Lecture 3, I gave it a title. It's called The Afrocentric Paradigm Towards 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 an Afrocentric towards an Afrocentric paradigm in the study of the Caribbean in Caribbean thought and Caribbean studies. Can't remember something to that effect. In other words, centering Caribbean thought, focusing Caribbean studies on a paradigm that is inclusive of its African heritage, its real heritage, not one that has been bastardized, corrupted into something else. One that stresses the importance of cultivating what? A consciousness of victory as opposed to dwelling on oppression. So we are not going to start with colonization anymore. We're not going to start with slavery anymore. Because that is not so then towards I'm gonna is that I might ask a question, was Walter Rodney being Afrocentric, Eurocentric, or is he part of the tradition of Afrocentrism? Are feminists Afrocentric, or can they be Afrocentrist? The strategy, anyways, moving right along, the strategy is Afrocentrism. It places Africa at the center of African people's world. The strategy is Afrocentrism, which places Africa at the center of African people's world, while stressing all people's entitlement to practice and celebrate their own culture as long as it does not interfere with the collective well-being. Now, let me stop here. This is important. Let me ask you a question to think about. You don't have to answer. Let me ask you a question. It's the strategy in Afrocentricity is Afrocentrism, placing Africa at the center of African people's world. Who are you? I'm asking you, who are we? Are you African people? By the way, one of my professors had a problem with me using the word Caribbean diaspora. He was mad, or African diaspora. He was mad. Fail F. Anyways, the strategy of who are you? How do you make that determination? Are we African people, or people of African ancestry? So we are of Africa. In fact, many of you would think that you're predominantly African. Africa. The strategy is Afrocentrism places Africa at the center of the African people's world. Is Africa at the center of your world? Or does it occupy a very important position in your world? Or is it Europe? Anyways, while stressing all people's entitlement to practice it, and the thing about Afrocentricity or Afrocentricity Afrocentricity is not about promoting any one way over another. However, it focuses on cultivating a consciousness of victory, especially for the African people. It places set Africa at the center of African people's world. Now, I said, when I read the Afrocentric paradigm, I was mixed. I was apoplectic. I said, this raises a provocative question. Does Afrocentricity promote cultural hegemony by advocating for a dominant African worldview? Let me say this again. Say, for example, Abriel and Chantal was just talking about this. So the question is, this raises a provocative question. Does Afrocentricity, does it promote cultural hegemony? You know what hegemony is, right? Does it promote cultural hegemony? Cultural hegemony, promoting one aspect of a people's culture over another. Cultural hegemony, by advocating for a dominant African worldview. Saying that, oh, Africa starts with everything and ends with everything. Of course, many Africologists would say that. Of course, I don't know if I have the Iliad here. The Iliad, they don't start with Africa. They start with probably somewhere else. The challenge then becomes, how can African people preserve their culture and identity within a dominant, and by the way, there is no dominant African worldview. I'm going to say that, but okay. But when I wrote this paper, I was perplexed about that. Importantly, the challenge then becomes this. How can African people preserve their culture and identity within a dominant global culture that has long sought to undermine and distort African culture within the framework of Western civilization? The very institutions that we have in the Caribbean today are built upon a Eurocentric philosophy and ideology that has transplanted, supplanted, and even created laws to preserve its preeminence and dominance over anything else, and has even worked to create false truths about other practices. I talk about, at Georgetown, one of the things I was doing for my dissertation is looking at privilege, power, position, and status, looking at how in the history of man, it has always been defined by them people trying to strike their own egos, to stroke their own egos. Okay? It was always about privilege and dominance. Man has always sought to raise himself above the others, the selfishness and ego and pride. And it's even within the very religious institutions that we find ourselves, that many of us are beholden to. Moreover, it is important to note that being African does not necessarily equate to being Afrocentric. You don't have to be dread to be Rasta. Remember that? Dr. Mazama emphasizes Afrocentricity stresses the importance of cultivating a consciousness of victory as opposed to dwelling on oppression. A significant misunderstanding of Afrocentricity is provided by Russell Adams. Russell Adams in 1993 stated that the purest form of Afrocentrism states Africa as its center, as the source of the world's people and its most fundamental ideas and inventions. This idea underscores the need for a reorientation of African consciousness. You know, somebody asked, are we just going to be talking about Africa? We're not just going to be talking about Africa, but we live in a world that has been, where we are dominated with Eurocentrism and brainwashed and entrenched in it, with it. So in order for a rediscovery of self, we have to do what Franz Fanon says, tabula rasa. So to the point where we have to dominate ourselves. We have to overindulge ourselves with something that we never thought about, like Africa, which is part of our bones and sinews. Because when we start with Caribbean, we always start with Columbus. Not anymore. Columbus, who subjugated people, and then not only that, went and demoralized the people and brought those very demoralized people here. And that is the memory of the of the elevated man, of the Homo sapien black man. And this is the same man we're trying to tame in his society, a world where those who brought him here still don't want him to be tamed because that is going to be his demise. The Afrocentric paradigm itself is a project, a task to elevate African consciousness and foster unity. No easy feat in a world that, of course, the urban Indian people are saying, no, we're not Africans, we're Indians. You know what? We're humanist. But a kind of humanism that does not promote Europe over Africa or vice versa. The Afrocentric paradigm is a project, a task to elevate African consciousness. But in order to elevate a thing, then we have to flood, inundate, and dominate the airwaves with the reality of it, because it has been corrupted and made into nothingness and into something that it is not, whereby something else has been promoted, Eurocentrism, a kind of ism that continue to promote white racial supremacy and racism, and a Caribbean that continues to remain divided. The perennial question persists: how do we unite all Africans in a world intent on keeping us divided? From Garvey and Du Bois to Edward Seaga and Michael Manley, Kamala versus Donald Trump. The divisions among Africans are deliberate, as Kenneth Clark outlines in Dark Ghettos. The measure of freedom and resistance is not simply political autonomy, but the ability of the oppressed to control their destiny across generations. And it begins with cultivating a memory from the reality of a history of preeminence and sophistication, one of victory. Yet, despite these insights, many of us remain trapped in dark ghettos of thought and action, with a select few reaping the benefits of token progress. Let's talk about the intellectual divide, Garvey and Du Bois. Resistance movements historically face the same challenge: infighting, capitalist infiltration, and greed, as seen in Marcus Garvey's downfall, due to charges of mail fraud in the US. in the early part of the 1920s. But my Afrocentric paradigm seminar class explored similar themes, discussing Piven and Cowan's Poor People's Movements, where movements fail not because of lack of passion, but due to the absorption and manipulation by dominant capitalist structures. This echoes the ideological battles between figures like Edward Seaga, Michael Mann in Jamaica. Seaga's Reaganomics versus Manley's socialist leanings, often framed as a sellout versus patriot. Yet Seaga's strategy, like Garvey, meeting with the KKK, may have been more about pragmatism than betrayal. Yet, people are going to say that Edward Seaga was not an Afrocentrist. In fact, they call him a sellout. Marcus Garvey embraced some of the traditions of the KKK. In fact, he had lunch with them, I heard. But that was just one meeting. Bob Marley, for example, avoided the East-West binary and focused on African consciousness through Rastafarianism. Though even this was marginalized in Jamaica, seen as fringed by many. Still, Marley's reggae music became a global force, promoting African ideals and values. Although Bob Marley, many people would look down on Rastafarianism, but when they travel, they embrace Bob Marley. Quite ironic. Similarly, Obia, Voodoo, and revivalism are African Caribbean practices deeply tied to African spirituality. Yet they are vilified. They are vilified and attacked. And even recently, in 2021, when the Jamaican government decided to have open discussion about the legalization of Obia, the church said, no way, and said, it is evil. Using the very same narrative that has been entrenched by those haters who came to demonize, bastardize, and corrupt the purity of the African tradition, their practices, and the African himself. Our ancestors look upon us with hurt on how we treat with them, with indignity, the traditions that have come to create the African. When Jamaica's government announced an open discussion on the legalization of Obia in 2022, it faced severe backlash, illustrating how deeply entrenched Western theological ideals have become. In a Caribbean class, I was teaching. A student asked, "Sir, where do we draw the line? Why are we going back to Africa? Where where do we draw the line? Why are we going back to Africa when we've been here so long?" This question encapsulates the complexity of identity within the African diaspora, especially as some Africans in the diaspora prioritize Western education and perspectives, often to the detriment of African culture. Where do we draw the line? Why are we going back? We're going back because we continue to live in a society that has sought to oppress and to rewrite history. You see what's going on in the world today? White people are now saying, wait, what? Let's draw the brakes. We're giving black people too many opportunities. They are rising and we are in decline. Let's reset and go back. Go back to the days when Donald Trump can say, sorry, not Donald Trump. Donald Trump can say, let's build a Rivera out of the Gaza. A place belonging to a people. After they were just released as part of a ceasefire hostage negotiation between Israel and Hamas. Millions of people, millions of Palestinians were taken hostage and they were released. And they are released, and there is something about the land. The Palestinians, for them, their wealth is tied to the land, their connection to the land. They don't care about Riveras and edifice. Stop that right now. Stop it. Okay? Stop it. About edifice and land. But they release the Israelites. The Hamas released the Israelites turn them over to the Israelis. They had places to go. The Israelites released the Palestinians over to release the Palestinians. They had nowhere to go but to rubbles. But guess what? To them, it was everywhere. And then they turn around and say, oh, they're gonna turn the place into a Rivera, and all those people that's there that they just released back, they're gonna tell them to go back into captivity or into exile. Go to Jordan, go to Egypt. And then we're going to turn the place into a Rivera. And when we're done turning it into a Rivera, then they can come back and pay rent. Just so you know, it's not going to be free. They're going to have to pay rent. They're going to have to be able to buy. And guess what? They don't have money to buy that because the property value is going to be high. Because when whoever they turn it into a Rivera, it's going to be mad high. Who's going to be able to afford it? The Jews who live on the other side, who make money. They are going to be there. Because they're going to make it into a Rivera for all people, not just for the Palestinians. And guess what? They're going to be priced out. That's strategy. That's how Caribbean people should think when you make deals. You must think about what is on the other side of this deal. As I reflect on my academic journey from Georgetown University, from Georgetown to Temple, I'm reminded of the importance of education in shaping consciousness. At Georgetown, foundational courses in Western civilization began with Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, with no significant focus on Egypt or Africa's influence on civilization. This gap in education perpetuates the erasure of Africa's intellectual and cultural contributions. Yet, in this doctoral program at Temple, I've begun to explore Afrocentric perspectives more deeply, thanks to people like Dr. Mazama herself, whose work we are examining. This realization about our education system, the exclusion of African history and ideologies, has led me to critically assess my studies, my philosophy, my theology, and advocate for curriculum and reform. As scholars, we must press for the inclusion of African perspectives, not just in Africology departments, but across disciplines, churches, institutions, to decolonize education and promote an authentic understanding of African contributions to global civilization. And I'm going to say, yes, decolonize. Decolonize, because in many instances, our minds are still under colonization. No longer are we under the control of our masters in a sense. Yet we are still to decolonize our education system and our laws. The Afrocentric paradigm challenges us to rethink the foundations of knowledge, identity, and power. African unity remains elusive. African unity remains elusive. You know, I believe if we had a sense of this Afrocentric paradigm and this Afrocentricity, what it really was and is, then we would not have made the mistakes. The Caribbean leaders would not have made the mistakes that they made in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1990s. That is why we need to center Caribbean thought, center Caribbean studies. The Afrocentric paradigm, now, which is a paradigm means pattern. Okay, paradigm means pattern, and Afrocentric paradigm. We're talking about applying scientific principles to the discipline of to the discipline of Africology or to Caribbean thought or to Black studies or whatever. A pattern of seeing things, or centering. We talk about the African man, the man. Seeing Africa as the center. But how do we do this? The Afrocentric paradigm provides a way to do that. It provides a disciplined way of doing that. A disciplined way. And we're going to, and she talks about that disciplined way in terms of how we conduct our epistemology. How we live in the world. That's what some people's Afrocentric paradigm behoves them to embrace a kind of Afrocentricity where they change their names from a Western Anglo-Saxon Christian name to one that's African. You know, when the Chinese come here, you see some Chinese or Asian people named John, Dan, Peter. Why they have these names? No, and they say, what's your real name? What's your real name? But the Afrocentric paradigm challenges us to rethink the foundations of knowledge. We talk about the cosmological, and how for the African, and we're going to talk about African. We have to look at the African personality some other time. Now, oh yeah, we're going to probably talk about that a little bit in a second. It challenges us to rethink the foundations of knowledge, identity, and power. And power. By the way, this class encourages us to we have to do critical thinking. Because all I'm telling you now, you're now thinking in your minds about everything else, about who we are and what we do and what we believe and how we believe it. Is it a religion of hate? African unity remains elusive, complicated by the forces of globalization and the legacy of colonization. Colonialism. Yet Afrocentricity offers a framework, a frame that works for reclaiming our history and forging a future rooted in African consciousness. As I continue my studies, I am committed to deepening my understanding of Afrocentricity and contributing to the project of African unity. This may include exploring and actively responding to the question from reflection, which is this. The challenge is, how do we unite all Africans in a world that has made sure we remain divided? Because even today, many people are still divided as to what it is to be African, or how do we practice this this Afrocentric paradigm or this Afrocentricity. People that there is this divide about how it is lived, how it is practiced, and there are those who look on others with suspicion because they don't believe that you can't be a postmodernist or liberal or a Marxist, but yet still many Pan-Africanists are Marxists. The fact that we have an African-American woman as vice president and potentially the next president of the United States, that I wrote this paper some time ago, may help contextualize the very victory the Afrocentric paradigm speaks of. But not necessarily so. When I wrote this paper, that's what I said, but no. A victory not just over historical erasure, but one rooted in resistance and the reclaiming of African narratives that have been distorted and misplaced. Let's talk about the inaccuracies of Afrocentrism and the 7 basic African cultural characteristics of Karanga. We're going to talk about this when we come back. We're going to take a quick break. Okay? Okay, we're back towards the end of my presentation earlier. I have some questions which I posed to Dr. Mazama. Dr. Mazama, who wrote the Afrocentric paradigm. And I said at the end of my essay, I said, to the professor, I said, in your introduction to the Afrocentric paradigm, you explain that it is not just an attitude, but a reflection of our victories. This is at the end of the reflection, I am asking Professor Mazama, who wrote the Afrocentric paradigm, I'm asking her some questions. I said, Dr. Mazama, in the introduction of the Afrocentric, in the introduction to the Afrocentric, you spoke of African history not merely as one of defeat, but of strategy, resilience, and triumph. This moment of a Black woman with roots in formerly colonized nations, standing as one of the most powerful leaders in the world. We're talking about Kamala Harris. That's what I was making reference to. Feels like a victory, an extension of the ongoing fight for recognition and justice. Yet it raises deeper questions. What does this victory mean? How do we frame the stories we tell from here? Does supporting Vice President Harris become essential in this paradigm, or supporting one person over another? And how do we reckon with those of African descent who might support different leaders, such as Donald Trump? That there are African people who were supporting Donald Trump. Is that in conflict with the Afrocentric paradigm? Those who continue to go to white churches, or, is that in conflict with the Afrocentric paradigm? Or is it part of the complexity of progress and the fight for true liberation? And of course, we have all the reference list there. I'm going to answer that question. But before I do, I just want to talk about, I want to look at the inaccuracies of Afrocentrism and the 7 basic African cultural characteristics of Karenga. And earlier I referenced Russell Adams in my paper. So the question is on the inaccuracies of Russell Adams and Paul Gauguin. According to Russell Adams, the purest form of Afrocentrism places Africa as the source of the world's people and its most fundamental ideas and inventions. Now, earlier we were having a debate, and Abrel Ellis said Africa is the beginning of all thing and the end of all thing. Nothing is wrong with saying that. There are those who believe that. There are those who don't believe that. African fundamentalists believe that, but whatever the case is. But in Africology, we believe that everything starts from Africa anyways. But it's some people. But listen to this. Russell Adams says, the purest form of Afrocentrism places Africa as the source, the purest form. If you cannot be an Afrocentrist or part of the tradition of Afrocentrism, I mean, that's not, if it's if you don't see Africa as the source of the world's people and its most fundamental ideas and inventions. Paul Gauguin further adds that the Afrocentrists carries with him or herself the power to what? To regenerate the earth. The Afrocentrist carries within himself or herself the power to regenerate the earth. Concluding that the earth will no longer be ruled by Eurocentrists, but rather the Afrocentric vision for humanity. Is it correct to say that Afrocentrism places Africa as the source, at the source of the world's people and its most fundamental ideas and inventions? What is Afrocentrism? According to Sarah Balakrishna, Afrocentrism deals with the decolonization of the mind and involves a long narrative political tradition that concerns itself with history, Africa, and the grassroots and political traditions of Africa. You will be asked this question in the exam. Again, what is Afrocentrism? According to Sarah Balakrishna, Afrocentrism deals with the decolonization of the mind and involves a long narrative political tradition that concerns itself with history, Africa, and the grassroots political tradition of Africans. Afrocentricity was a reaction to what Africologists such as Ashanti saw was the continued condition of Africans despite the rich history of Africans, to restore the real center of history for Africans who have developed behaviors and attitudes from memories that were not true about the African people. Behaviors are driven by memory. Memorization is important and is part of learning. Very important. And so we talk about Afrocentricity, the decolonization of the mind, but of whiteness. Afrocentricity was a reaction to what Africologists such as Ashanti saw as the continued condition of Africans despite the rich history of Africans, to restore the real center of history for Africans who have developed behaviors and attitudes. So the behavior and attitudes come from memory. But what is the memory of the black man, of the African in the Caribbean? When we start to talk about identity, where do we begin? Is it from an oppressive history? Memory. So part of African centering is moving away from a defeatist position. Again, we're talking about that, moving away from this colonization to one of sophistication. Africans develop behaviors and attitudes from memory. A memory that says Africans are primitive, and then you see drawings of primitive Africans with monkey and stuff, and there is nothing that was given by anything black in history is always one associated with a big whip over his back or something primitive. According to Balakrishnan, there exists two Africa, one that was from the time of Kemet, C. Diop's African civilization. That's why I said, people say, oh, can African people could have built boats to come here? Europeans learned shipbuilding from the Africans. And soon after they met with the Africans, they came straight to the West Indies, but as soon as they learned that it existed. There exists two Africa. One that was from the time of Kemet, and that was Chantel. And this is in JTS online with references, and you can type in Diop's African civilization. It will come up in your Google. And another created by the Europeans and the African slaves. Again, let me say this again. This is powerful. There exists two Africa. One that was from the time of Kemet. You can choose to read African history by reading Diop's book or the Europeans' book, or the other Africa created by Europeans and the African slaves. However, the Africa of memory is the one of oppression, the one created by the Europeans and the African slaves, not of victory and civility. Hence, Africologists sought to create a paradigm, a pattern, a discipline couched with a pattern that centers and focuses the African wherever he is and his navigation of life. Russell Adams and Pauline Gouger departs from this political narrative. From this political narrative. Because that is what we're talking about here. That is what we're talking about. There exists two Africa. One of victory, one of defeat. And it is that Africa of memory that has come to dominate the African wherever he is, that continues to betray him or her. Russell Adams and Pauline Gouger departs from this political narrative or tradition of advancing a view of Afrocentricity, because Russell Adams, when he says the purest form of Afrocentrism places Africa as the source of the world's people and its fundamental ideas and inventions. And when Pauline say that the Afrocentrist carries within him or herself the power to regenerate the earth, that is not Afrocentricity. That is radicalist position. They depart from the political narrative or tradition of advancing a view of Afrocentricity that promoted the deconstruction of whiteness and the promotion of agency. The Afrocentricity that we are here advocating for here, in proper perspective, is away from Pauline Gouger and from Russell Adams, is not one of privilege and position. It's not one that sees Africa as the source of all things, but one that understands Africa through its very rich history and contribution to humanity. One from the time of Kemet, from where Africa had civilization. And not only one created by the Europeans and the African slaves. Russell Adams and Pauline Couture depart from that political narrative or tradition of advancing a view of Afrocentricity that promoted the deconstruction of whiteness and the promotion of agency, cultural dissemination, and economic empowerment to one that became what was antithetical. Am I recording? Make sure I'm recording. I am. Advancing a view of Afrocentricity that promoted the destruction, the deconstruction of whiteness and the promotion of agency, cultural dissemination, and economic empowerment to one that became what was antithetical to the African and the tradition, universalism and fundamentalism. In Eurocentrism, and by the way, let me say this again. Russell Adams and Pauline Couture position on Afrocentricity as Africa as the purest and the source of all things. We're calling that universalism and fundamentalism. That is what we're calling it. In Eurocentrism, there is only one way to see the world. In Eurocentrism, there is only one way to see the world. In fact, I left these readings believing that Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism was about ethnocentrism, assuming that Afrocentricity and Africologists promote cultural hegemony, a dominant form of seeing the world or a dominant perspective. However, to be African is not to be necessarily to be African is not to be necessarily to be Afrocentric. Just as one does not have to be dread to be Rasta. You guys may have to revisit what I'm saying now when I play the lecture. Because this is quite powerful what I'm saying here. Eurocentrism promotes universalism and fundamentalism. Afrocentricity does not promote that. Afrocentricity only promotes, we only argue that Afrocentricity is only one way of seeing the world. Sorry. In Eurocentrism, there is only one way to see the world. Very important. Let me say this again. Russell Adams and Pauline Couture departs from this political narrative. What political narrative? Or tradition? What tradition? Of advancing a view of Afrocentricity. What view of Afrocentricity? A view of Afrocentricity that promoted what? The deconstruction of whiteness, one, and the promotion of cultural, of agency. The deconstruction of whiteness and the promotion of agency. 3, cultural dissemination to spread the culture, to share the culture, spread it. 4, and economic empowerment to one that became, so that's what Afrocentricity promotes. But now Russell Adams, Pauline Couture, and others corrupt Afrocentricity to one that has become antithetical to the African and the tradition, to one that is universalistic and fundamentalistic. In Eurocentrism, there is only one way to see the world. In fact, I left the readings believing that Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism was about ethnocentrism. I did at first when I just came up on this study, assuming that I was opposed to it. I'm like, this is ridiculous. All this Afro this and that. I didn't use those nice words. Now, I left the readings believing that Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism was about ethnocentrism, assuming that Afrocentricity and Africologists promote what? Cultural hegemony, dominance, a dominant form of seeing the world. That's what cultural hegemony is. A dominant way of seeing the world, or a dominant perspective. I thought that Afrocentrism and Afrocentricity was about cultural hegemony, just like Eurocentricity. But no, it was not. However, to be African is not to be necessarily Afrocentric, just as one does not have to be dread to be Rasta. Russell, like Gauger, does not, he adopts a type of Platonic fundamentalism or essentialism about the world and its people entirely. And I'm going to talk about essentialism shortly. Again, Russell Adams, like Pauline Gauger, adopts a type of Platonic fundamentalism or essentialism about the world and its people entirely. So they continue. They're talking about Africa. So just because you're talking about Africa doesn't necessarily mean you're Afrocentric. But you're talking about it in a very universalistic and fundamental way, as if everybody must be it and only certain people can do this and that and the third. However, according to Dr. Mazama, in the Afrocentric paradigm, Afrocentricity challenges Eurocentrism as one way of viewing the world. In addition, Afrocentricity stresses the importance of cultivating a consciousness of victory as opposed to dwelling on oppression. Therefore, Russell Adams and Gauger are striking examples of total misunderstanding of Afrocentricity. In fact, I had made the same error after reading the Afrocentric paradigm. I did. And after reading Afrocentric paradigm and Ashanti's history of Africa and Edward Blyden's African personality. I'm sorry, guys. I am sorry. Give me a second. I am sorry, guys. I'm sorry for the distraction. I do not appreciate the distraction in the background when I'm teaching my class. It's also creating a distraction for me. It will not happen again. We'll continue with the class. I'm making the point that Russell Adams and Pauline Gauger are striking examples of total misunderstanding of Afrocentricity. In fact, I had made the same error. And I was making the point that when I read the Afrocentric paradigm, it took me a while to really sink my teeth into it. It took me a while. It was challenging, but because you can't just read it and move on. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. That means a lot, and that says a lot. So you really have to. So when I read it first, I thought they were talking about cultural hegemony. But yet there are those who promote Afrocentrism as the source of all things, and they're very prideful about it in a sense. But I thought that after reading Afrocentric paradigm, Ashanti's history of Africa, and Edward Blyden's no, Edward Blyden's book, Dr. Naomi's African Personality, I thought that Afrocentricity promoted a form of fundamentalism. Example, Pauline Couture promoted a type of Afrocentricity that reestablishes colonialism, but by Africans, giving them the unique and rare power to rule and inspire as if no other can do so. That's Pauline Couture statement that I read earlier. That's what he is implying. This was the same attitude and condition of the white colonizer. The same thing that Eurocentric ideas and that Eurocentrism was about. It's the same, and the colonizer, the same thing that when you start to read people like Pauline Couture and some of these radicalist Pan-Africanists, it's as if you're reading the same thing. But that is not what it is. Those who occupy that condition, that's the same condition of the white colonizer. Attitudes that were antithetical to the African. Edward Blyden advances the African as communal, peaceful, inspirational, creative, and giver of civilization, who thought that everyone had civilization, which added to our demise. Because I asked the question, if Africans were so powerful, why is it that they became so pauperized? And according to Edward Blyden or to others, that they believe that everybody had civilization. Dr. Kimani Nahushi from Temple University said they thought that everybody had civilization, but then they realized, no, it wasn't like that everywhere else. Edward Blyden advances the Africa as communal, peaceful, inspirational, creative, and giver of civilization. In the 1880s, in the 1850s, Edward Blyden was a missionary in Africa, sent there came from London. And he turned around and said to the church, you know what? Let us create a school that understands their culture, their language, and teach them their language in their own way, in the way that they want to do it, and we will teach you how to do it. He became missionary to the missionaries. Edward Blyden. He advances that the African as communal, peaceful, inspirational, creative, and giver of civilization, who thought that everyone had civilization. And he said that is why that aided in the African demise. That's why Europe was able to come in and underdevelop them. Gouger, in his approach to Afrocentricity, is hoping to change the African. Is hoping to change the African. So as to become what he despises. Gouger, Pauline Gouger, in his approach to Afrocentricity. And when we talk about, earlier we read about Pauline Gouger said this. The Afrocentrist carries within himself or herself the power to regenerate the earth. That is in the Afrocentric paradigm. And he said that. And, okay, he did say that. And what we are saying is this. Pauline Gouger, in his approach to Afrocentricity, is hoping to change the African so as to become what he despises. White, the white man. You change one thing and to become something you despise. Isn't that an irony? White and controlling? That is not what we are aiming for in Afrocentricity or within a Caribbean thought that is aiming for Afropolitanism within our cosmopolitanism. It was Balfour in the English Parliament in the 1600s, in his address to Parliament, that defended the colonization of ancient Kemet, calling it Egypt, and declaring that if anything good came from Egypt, it was because of the English, and that nothing good or great came from the Kemetians themselves. It was given by England. This was the culture of the white man. That was what he said in Parliament. A center driven by greed and fundamentalism, which was distant from the cultural center of the African. Nothing good comes from Africa. Anything good that comes from it is us, it is the British, it's the white man that brought it there. And they created a history that made it so. That is the Afrocentricity that some people want. That is not what we are advocating for. In closing, what is correct is that Afrocentrism places at the center of African people's world, places Africa at the center of African people's world, while stressing all people's entitlement to practice and celebrate their own culture as long as it does not interfere with the collective well-being. All people have a perspective which stems from their centers. All people have a perspective which stems from your centers. So when the Jamaican government or when Caribbean government ask about legalizing obeah, and the church can quickly respond by saying, can quickly turn it down and call it evil, it means then that the center that the people here in the Caribbean have has been manipulated, bastardized, corrupted to the fact that they are willing to reject something that calls for that because their center has been misplaced. Their center is not Africa, their center is Europe. While Eurocentrism imposes itself as universal, Afrocentrism demonstrates that it is only one way to view the world. Well, it is only one way. Now, there's a difference between saying it is the only way as against it is only one way. So let me say this again. And if you read the Afrocentric paradigm, you read that. And you might say, what is he talking about? What are they talking about? That's why many people left interpreting a paradigm or an idea about Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism that is incorrect, because they hear the word Afrocentrism demonstrates that it is only one way to view the world, and all they hear it is the only way. No, that's Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism imposes itself as universal. It is only one way. I mean, it is the only way to view the world. While Afrocentrism demonstrates that it is Afrocentrism itself. It is only one way. It is one way of seeing the world. It is one way of viewing the world. That is what separates Eurocentrism from Afrocentrism. The fact that Eurocentrism is universal and fundamental, while Afrocentrism is not. It is open and affirming. Eurocentrism imposes itself as universal. Afrocentrism demonstrates itself as one way. Afrocentrism says it is only one way to view the world. Eurocentrism says it is the only way to view the world. I want to skip down now to what are the 7 characteristics of Maulana Karenga? What are the 7 characteristics of Maulana Karenga? By the way, I'm not finished. It says, I made an error here. the idea here is talking about hegemony. And of course, Afrocentricity does not promote cultural hegemony in the world. It's open and affirming. Okay. But before I end today's class, there's one thing I must talk about. What are the 7 characteristics of Mulana Karinga? I will end the class if I don't get to do anything else. I will do this. We will take a 5 minute break. When we come back, I will share my presentation looking at the 7 characteristics of Mulana Karinga. What are the 7 basic characteristics of Maulana Karenga? The 7 basic African cultural characteristics, and then which one determines the others. In your discussion, explain what each refers to. I'm being very generous when I share these articles and these notes, because you might just see the very same thing in your exam. And I'm deliberately saying these things because I realize that at JTS, you can pass everything and come to class. You could be an angel in this course, and you can fail the exam, and you can get 70%, 60, 50% and fail the entire course, which is quite unfortunate. But that's how it is. We'll take a 5 minute break. When we come back, we look at the 7. This particular part is very important to me. It's one of the most important part of the lecture today, and then we'll end. All right, we'll take a break. We'll come back at 5:15. In fact, what seems to have been unclear among the students was whether there was any difference between Afrocentrism and Afrocentric. Yet, no one mentioned Afrocentrism. No one mentioned Afrocentrism. Rather, the students, in my estimation, spoke of Afrocentricity as the highest political tradition of Afrocentrism or African liberation. Some students argued that Du Bois was not Afrocentric, and so too was Fanon, because they were not centered on Africa and still relied on European traditions within their strategies. It was as if Du Bois and Fanon were not significant because they were not Afrocentric enough. Regardless, what they were was part of a tradition we call Afrocentrism. I'm Renaldo McKenzie, and welcome to another episode of the Neoliberal Round podcast. This is part 2, I believe, of a series that we are doing here at the Neoliberal Round entitled Reflections in Afrocology. I'm chronicling my journey in the PhD program at Temple University in Afrocology and African American Studies. Today's topic is I'm sharing a presentation on Afrocentrism and Afrocentricity. The question is, how does Sarah Balakrishna approach Afrocentrism and Afrocentricity? How does she differentiate between the two? And of course, this is a paper or presentation I'm presenting to Dr. Amma Mazama, who's the chair of the Department of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University. She's also the professor for the Afrocentric paradigm class, and she's also the author of the Afrocentric paradigm and many other essays and books and so on. But let's continue with the presentation or the article. Now, continuing, I said that Sarah Balakrishna attempted to delineate between Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism in her article entitled Afrocentrism Revisited, Africa in the sense of, or Africa in the philosophy of Black nationalism. Again, Sarah Balakrishna attempted to delineate between Afrocentricity and Afrocentrism in her article entitled Afrocentrism Revisited, Africa in the philosophy of Black nationalism. Now, she does not make the mistake of downplaying the contributions of any to our history, but discusses the history and development of Africa and its struggle for liberation within the historical. In a sense, Balakrishnan, in her essay here or article here, attempted to reconcile the divide between those who advocated for one kind of liberation and Africanism or Africanity for another, and brought clarity to the debate by suggesting where and when Africanism and its rich tradition begins, transcending Afrocentricity to considering the rich historical and political traditions and contributions towards African liberation, beginning with the first evidence of African civilization. Balakrishnan's approach is macroscopic and broad, or considers the general and the whole instead of looking at particulars or aspect of African reality, to move the tradition and experience, or to make the tradition and the experience inclusive. Nevertheless, she makes a comparison between the whole or the general, that is Afrocentrism, and the particular, that is Black nationalism, and Afrocentricity, and so on. Balakrishna, I apologize, here I noticed an error in my article. Now, Balakrishnan splits up Afrocentrism into political traditions or movements such as Black nationalism, Garveyism, and Afrocentricity or the Afrocentric movement. In terms of describing Afrocentrism within the tradition or movement of Black nationalism, Balakrishnan uses a Marxist notion of self to conceptualize how, through strategies or systematic means, Africans became dispossessed of self. So the repossession of self through self-discovery and developing a consciousness of resilience defined the Black nationalist movement of the 19th and early 20th century. We're talking about Pan-African movement, Garveyism, Negritude, the Black Panther and independent movements. All these came about as part of this was part of this Afrocentric or this Afrocentrism that or this Black nationalist movement that led to a consciousness of resilience. According to Balakrishnan, in this sense, Afrocentrism, and I'm quoting here, I'm quoting directly from Balakrishnan's article. In this sense, Afrocentrism belonged to a political tradition known as Black nationalism, having formed one of its earliest variations. Unlike in the European mold, the nation of Black nationalism, or the notion of Black nationalism, did not emerge technocratically with the modern state. Rather, on the collective level, Black nationalism has concerned the Africans' dispossession of self, which is an ontological alienation consequent of the continuous subordination of black life to capital, whether through slavery, colonization, or apartheid. In the pursuit of self-repossession, in the pursuit of self-repossession, or talking about self-sovereignty, black nationalism seeks to infuse blackness with meaning and personhood, with liberty and destiny. Afrocentrism locates Africa as the necessary starting point for this project. From Africa, a validity or a vitality lay in its uncovered histories, in its resilient rituals and material cultures, which, despite all manners of repression, preserved on both sides of the Atlantic, uniting a people otherwise consolidated only through sheer violence. In the words of Archie Mafehe, Africanity thus constitutes a combative ontology. And earlier we used the word Africanity, and she's borrowing from Archie Mafehe or Mafehe, that says Africanity thus constitutes a combative ontology across a genealogy of struggle extending from Pan-Africanism to Black power, Black consciousness, negritude, and Garvism. Afrocentrism has shaped Black politics around Africa's provocative place as a praxis for resistance. So that is one tradition of, or that is part of the tradition of Afrocentrism. Now, in terms of describing Afrocentrism within the tradition of Afrocentricity, according to Sarah, Afrocentricity is part of an academic movement that started in, and by, I apologize, according to Sarah Balakrishnan, Afrocentricity is part of an academic movement that started in universities in the US, largely by Ashanti and others such as Karenga in the 1960s. Balakrishnan leaves out Du Bois' contributions and Ashanti's role in developing or linking Afrocentricity to a paradigm in the 1980s. For Balakrishnan, while Afrocentrism is a political tradition of liberation, Afrocentricity is part of the rich tradition that is Afrocentrism, and so too is the contributions of Fanon and Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Blyden, Baldwin, Morrison, Douglas, and Garvey, so on and so forth. Balakrishnan's essay revisits Afrocentrism as a foundation for the Black radical tradition. It argues that Afrocentrism presupposed the relationship between Blackness and Africa to be the central problem for emancipatory thought. End of quote. Now, it is this thread that has largely been debated among Black African nationalism and nationalists and scholars. The argument surrounding what constitutes African values, such as should Black men marry white women? Should Black people vote? Should Black men have Black Jesus? Are we still Marxists, feminists, and postmodernists? Should we call ourselves niggers, Negroes, or the names given by our colonial masters or African ancestors, such as should I still go by Renaldo McKenzie? But of course, my great-grandfather is Scottish, a white Scottish man who met this Black Jamaican mixed with Maroonage history, met in Cuba and produced several sons, and I'm part of that lineage. But whatever the twain, for Bob Marley, so the question continues. And I'm going to say this again. It is this thread that has largely been debated among Black or African nationalists and scholars. The arguments surrounding what constitutes African values, such as should Black men marry white women? Should Black people vote? Should Black men have Black Jesus? Are we still Marxist, feminists, and postmodernists? Should we call ourselves niggers, Negroes, or the names given by our colonial masters or our African ancestors? Should we drive Teslas and wear Nike? Should we backslide and not go to church? Should we go back to Africa? For Bob Marley, he resorts to a new religion, that is the I or Rastafari. Fanon had said we must do something revolutionary, meaning starting from nothing or from scratch, as tabula rasas in the book Wretched of the Earth, he says that. But that is defeatist and creates more abnormality, as we cannot deny the reality of being, which is bound up in who we are or who we have become. we will create something new that is informed by what we now know of our own histories. Importantly, these rich debates, conversations, and questions have defined our rich narratives which have contributed to our history, that have created many forms that have represented Afrocentrism, or that represent Afrocentrism. For Balakrishnan, Afrocentricity is a form or aspect of Afrocentrism, or represent a moment or a period and movement in Afrocentrism and history. Afrocentricity rose up in the 20th century as a challenge to institutional politics and included several waves, from Diop forensic applications, deconstructing African civilizations, to Du Bois sociological studies and Afrocentric pronouncements of Africa, to Ashanti's philosophical applications within a scientific manner. Balakrishnan discusses the history of Afrocentricity from Edward Blyden to Ashanti, but then stated that Afrocentricity is a movement which started in US academic institutions in the 1980s. This seemed quite contradictory. Balakrishnan wrote in her essay that in the 1980s, the term Afrocentrism came to represent this school of inquiry, following the 1980 publication of Afrocentricity by African-American scholar Molefi Kete Ashanti. In her historical analysis of the development of Afrocentrism, Sarah Balakrishnan interprets Ashanti's Afrocentricity, and I'm noticing another error here. Sarah Balakrishnan interprets Ashanti's Afrocentricity as a period in our history that led to the reasserting of African identity by many adopting African names and styles and embracing African traditions and spirituality over Christianity, such as embracing Islam over Christianity. According to Balakrishnan, and I quote, born as Arthur Lee Smith, Ashanti adopted an African name in 1976 in place of his Anglo-American appellation. A ritual undertaken by inheriting black studies. Thousands of Afrocentric practitioners, including Ron Everett, who changed his name to Molani Karenga, and Leroy Jones, who changed his name to Amiri Baraka. The choosing of an African name is participatory in as much as it contributes to the total rise of consciousness, writes Ashanti in Afrocentricity. According to the text, Afrocentricity constituted a philosophical perspective associated with the discovery, location, and actualization of African agency within the context of history and culture. It located Africa's past as a necessary starting point for political and social freedom, not in the least because it provided the foundation for conceptualizing a free Africa as a prophetic horizon. Afrocentricity also emphasized the importance of cultural self-styling as a political practice, readopting an African identity, restored the protection of heritage and the burden of history to black communities whose dehumanization in the form of sale and commoditization had demanded the disavowal of any essence beyond objecthood. In this manner, Afrocentrists approached Africanity as a historical consciousness requiring specific embodied practices. From the 1960s to 90s, Afrocentric teaching spread through grassroots political channels on the community level, but remained closely tied to academic institutions. The arrival of black studies on American campuses transformed curricula into sites of controversy, indicted for the myriad ways that racial supremacy remained reified in their objectivist knowledge. Black studies program, especially in Los Angeles and Philadelphia, became vocal progenitors of a new African history, built as a Eurocentric counterforce. Monographs of Afrocentrism were printed on all black presses based in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Oakland, written mainly for non-academic audiences. In the 1990s, Afrocentrism also spurred the successful campaign for separate Afrocentric high schools, such as Imhotep in Philadelphia, with proponents arguing that teaching Afrocentric curricula would be no different than Christian schools with creationism. And of course, this is something that Edward Blyden promoted and tried in Africa, and he himself tried to become the missionary to missionaries on a mainstream cultural level. Probably Afrocentricity most famous hallmark remains the holiday of Kwanzaa, initiated by Karanga in 1966 as an important component of Kawada. Of course, this all happened, you could point all the way to Biden. However, Balakrishnan failed to appropriate. However, this is another critique I have of Balakrishna here, is that she failed to appropriate Pan-African history and tradition accurately. Ashanti did not develop Afrocentricity, but built on the tradition of Du Bois, who developed the sociological approach to African history and experience. In fact, it is said in Africology that it is widely believed that it is Du Bois, credit is given to Du Bois for developing the term Afrocentric. And of course, Ashanti's Afrocentric paradigm resolved the discontent among disciplines and institutions that attacked African studies and scholarship as being interdisciplinary and in conflict with other disciplines. Now, Dr. Mazama in the Afrocentric paradigm discusses Ashanti's Afrocentricity as a discipline, science, and modus operandi, as against Sarah's description of Afrocentricity as an academic movement developed in between the 1960s and 80s. Balakrishnan provides the historical traditions of African history from the 1500s up to the 1980s. However, Balakrishnan does not reduce Afrocentrism to a principle, but a political tradition. Balakrishnan reduces and dilutes the potency of Afrocentricity, describing it as a single movement, stating that Afrocentrism involves long narrative grassroots political historical traditions that is not simply a movement. Then advances the concept of Afrocentricity as a movement in U.S. Academy in the 1980s to pursue liberation through African thought and praxis. For Balakrishnan, Afrocentricity is the movement that pursues Afrocentrism, which is a long narrative tradition regarding history in Africa, grassroots political language among black communities for generations, which spans the beginning of life as we know it up to now. It involves victory and struggle, which have both come to shape the African in the world today. A world moving towards economically a technological, globalized, and socially multicultural neoliberal world. The economics link the social and the ways cultures and societies have been historically organized and how they change. For Balakrishnan, Afrocentrism, unlike Afrocentricity, confronts the problem of race twofold. Firstly, through a racial revolution, which is a critique of history, and secondly, the critique must be from a uniquely African vantage point. Balakrishnan analyzes how Afrocentricity helps to support the second. The movement has created the discipline of Africology, focusing on Afrocentricity, but within a paradigm that helps to develop the African vantage point. Afrocentricity centers the African experience, but the paradigm which Sarah stopped short of discussing in her description of Afrocentricity goes further, which is why we needed Dr. Mazama to provide an analysis of the Afrocentric paradigm in the Afrocentric paradigm, which has given rise to one principle that can never be questioned by any person claiming to be Afrocentric. The Afrocentrist will not question the idea of the centrality of African ideals and values, but will argue over what constitute those ideals and values. Example, in the Afrocentric paradigm, Ashanti dismisses feminism as non-Afrocentric and rejects the concept and movement as non-African or not Afrocentric. For Ashanti, feminism opposes and goes against the very idea of the African culture and tradition to embrace masculinity and feminism. But for Ashanti, the feminist promotes women and rejects men. But this is not true. What many Afrocentrists have done in this regard is to take the most radical and extreme aspect of a concept to dismiss it. Yet they are quick to say that the best parts of Western civilization were influenced by ancient Africa. Now, while this is undeniable, one must not become too myopic when viewing the world. Feminism and Marxism also had aspects of its teachings that were ripe for the liberation fighters. It confronted and challenged the status quo, which was the pulse that helped to give rise to little freedoms we are able to muster up and live while working to carve out a future for our children and our grandchildren. Today, Shera Balakrishnan discusses a new tradition within Afrocentrism called Afropolitanism, marking the end of black nationalism and Afrocentricity. Shera Balakrishnan is an Indian-Canadian academic who obtained her PhD from Harvard University and is professor at Duke. Balakrishnan was influenced by Homi Bhabha, who helped to influence the concept of cosmopolitanism explained in Bhabha's Location of Culture, where the African becomes a multicultural and transcending subject in the world with hybrid cultures and identity, but a center that remains African. According to Balakrishnan, and of course, Afropolitanism is an extension of cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism is really looking at the Caribbean subject or the Indian subject or the post-colonial subject who now lives in the post-colonial subject who was formerly colonized, who now finds him or herself, the subaltern subject who now finds him or herself in the post-industrial, while of course the term Afropolitanism is more linked to Africa. Now, according to Balakrishnan, many of my earliest papers focused on a new political current transforming African cultural and literary studies today. This is the concept of Afropolitanism, a term coined by both the African diaspora author Tai Selassie and the Cameroonian philosopher Ekele Emembe. Emembe. She goes on to say that Afropolitanism refers to a way of being African in the world, of being African and cosmopolitan, and of observing African cultures themselves as hybridities formed from many different influences and roots. In the Afropolitan idea, I further elaborated on the long tradition of thinking about cosmopolitanism in Africa. Another essay, Afropolitanism and the End of Black Nationalism, published by Routledge, contained more reflections on the meaning of Afropolitanism in relation to Africa's relation with the African diaspora and some of the radical implications of this current of thought. Shera Balakrishnan does not even bother to mention the Afrocentric paradigm in her analysis of the tradition, and seems to have misunderstood the concept of Afrocentricity. Even in this new Afropolitanism, one must be careful that it is not an accommodationist position to continue to accept a culture that continues to discredit Africa and the peoples from Africa. Even within multiculturalism and Afropolitanism, there is the tendency to promote a fictional form of Afro or African for one that gives way to Western or European concept of the Afro aspect of the Afropolitan. One must still develop a consciousness of victory over one of oppression within any construct that attempts to create or recreate the transcended human being. Any hybrid being suggests a compilation of aspects where the African part is diffused and digested into a refurbished whiteness or African Americanness that continues to represent an essential aspect of a subject's being. Therefore, Shera Balakrishnan has done an academic injustice to the concept of Afrocentrism, diluting it to various traditions and periods, and even leaving out important aspects of the tradition such as the Afrocentric paradigm. This lack has provided a conclusion and invention leading to what we now know as Afropolitanism. That ends the reflection today, part 2 of my reflection and my journey. If you have any questions, Okay, guys, did you hear that? Did you guys hear that? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Great. I am going to wrap up quickly, the next quickly minutes, because I want to wrap up this. Next week, we're going to begin now looking at neoliberalism, globalization, income inequality, poverty, and resistance. We would look at what is the Caribbean, and I will begin by exploring the fact that African sailors came here before Columbus, and then we will talk about that. We will also begin. We will watch the film Life and Death, and we will preview a short interview talking about some other issues. But we want to begin looking at. You guys were supposed to write about in the introduction, to read the introduction of neoliberalism, and also the preface, formulate a reflection. We will discuss that. Hopefully, we'll have time to discuss it. Discuss it next week. But let me wrap this particular part of the lecture up by where is here. I said we were going to talk about the 7 characteristics of Karenga. What are the 7 characteristics of Mulana Karenga? And which one determines the others? In an Afrocentric paradigm class at Temple University's Anthropology Department, Professor Ama Mazama declared that the Afrocentric paradigm deals with the question of African identity from the perspective of African people. It deals with what? The Afrocentric paradigm deals with the question. And of course, you won't see this if you read the Afrocentric paradigm, you won't see that because I'm here talking with the author herself. And according to her, she says that the Afrocentric paradigm deals with the question of African identity from the perspective of African people. That was what she said. Now, according to Mazama, the argument is that African thought should be centered. African thought should be centered. Here we go again, the word center, center, center. Located. It should be African thought. And by extension, all that extends from African thought, which is Caribbean thought, should be centered, located, oriented, and grounded within the African way, the Caribbean way. Dr. Mazama concluded that that's why we talk, and by the way, Dr. Mazama herself is from the Caribbean. That's why we talk about that. She's from Martinique. Dr. Mazama concluded that's why we talk about that. And that's why I think we need to study ourselves. Unfortunately, can you imagine? Here is a Caribbean, a cosmopolitan, a Caribbean national living in the US from the Martinique, who is the head of the Afrocentric department, one of the few of its kind in the world, and have written about the Afrocentric paradigm, which is quite powerful and interesting. She did not invent the Afrocentric paradigm. The Afrocentric paradigm was started in African universities in the 1980s, led by Ashanti, and that led into the Afrocentric department at Temple Universities and many programs across the Americas, except in the Caribbean, which I hope the Caribbean can now include within its studies, within its departments, a kind of Afrocentric paradigm or Caribbean paradigm, including that of the Afrocentric paradigm. That's why we talk about. Anyway, according to Mazama, the argument is that African thought should be centered. It should be what? Centered. So we talk about African paradigm. It's related to this, what I'm about to say now. The argument is that the African thought should be centered, located, oriented, and grounded within the African way. So when we talk about the Afrocentric paradigm, stemming from Afrocentricity, we're talking about a grounding, We're talking about a centering, an orienting, a locating the thought, centering the thought, grounding the thought. Dr. Majama concluded that's why we talk about that. And that's why I think we need to study ourselves. Unfortunately, much of our center has been taken, so we need to work with the center. Some of us, because we don't know better, make statements that may not be accurate because we don't have the grounded necessary knowledge. We have false information. She said, I'm one African who has been misinformed and seem to, I'm responding by saying, I am one African who has been misinformed and seem to find myself in an antness. That's what I'm writing. And struggling to make sense of all this while asserting my identity. So Karenga becomes extremely useful in her prescription or solution to the problem of my identity and any misconception one may have about African cultural identity. Karenga believes that every culture has certain essential and Karenga, please remember Karenga was what? Karenga was Everett, was that what? Was Ron Everett. Milani Karenga, yeah, was Ron Everett. If you were listening to my presentation earlier that I played just now, Ron and Lee, Ashanti is Lee Smith, I think. But Karenga believes that every culture has certain essential characteristics. And these characteristics shapes one cultural identity. What has shaped the identity of the African is a misled. What has shaped today the identity of the African, or the African in the Caribbean, or the African in the Americas, or in the Western world, or in the world today, because Walter Rodney said that even Africa has been underdeveloped by Europe. So what has shaped the identity of the African is a misled idea about blackness, Africa, and Africans within a world that has been dominated by white supremacy. Karenga's Afrocentricity helped to promote African cultural identity by advancing 7 characteristics of African culture. This is necessary for the African to assert him or herself as a Black or African. Then we would achieve Black or African nationalism. To assert oneself as one thing or another, Karenga suggests that the African must embody Afrocentricity, proposes a method of getting out of the web of idol so that we think like an African, be like an African, act like an African. The freedom to be Africans, where we don't even curse ourselves to hell to think in African ways. Hence, building on the philosophy of Kawaida, Karenga identified 7 basic African cultural characteristics. According to Karenga, they are foundational, and that's why I'm happy I played the tape before I read this, because it was very important I played that before I played this. Now, according to Karenga, they are foundational to African cultural unity. We talked about that earlier, cultural unity, and are indispensable to the understanding of African traditions and values. According to Karenga, these 7 characteristics are: 1, spirituality and ethics. Not institutionalism brushed with a version of faith or spirituality they call whatever that religion is. Spirituality and ethics. That's Edward Blyden stated that. Again, I keep talking about Edward Blyden. Who the hell is Edward Blyden? Remind me to share. You can Google him, but remind me to share an article and a paper written about and by Edward Blyden. Okay. But Edward Blyden stated that a spiritual decolonization of the African is what will center the African, as African cultures are deeply rooted in spirituality, with an emphasis on the interconnectedness of life and the sacred. They were one with the cosmos. Very important. It is this spirituality that defined define and heal this brokenness to get back to who we are. No other character is more vital than this. And when you listen to my last week, you guys didn't have a class, but you guys were supposed to watch the the podcast where I've interviewed members of the Asserts Society, and they talk about the divine man and God man up and God woman up. Okay, I hope you guys watch that. It is this spirituality that define and heal this brokenness to get back to who we are. No other character is more vital than this. The African connections with his ancestors. Let me say this again. The African connections with his ancestors, and in the Roman Catholic Church, they practiced the idea of purgatory and praying to the dead. That was not always part of African tradition. It wasn't it became part of the tradition because because part of the African tradition, part of African spirituality was adopted into Roman Catholicism and then and as their own, and then put a different face to it or name. The same thing you learn when you start to now study certain religions and practices and what pertains, and start to compare it with previous understanding of African traditions, and you see those traditions, the influences of those African traditions within European traditions. Yet they said that Africa never had religion and they were primitive. We know Dottie Bookman came from Senegambia, and he himself could read and write, was skilled in the Quran, and they assassinated him because he was a problem. Okay? Just before the revolution in Haiti. No other character is more vital than it. The African connection with his ancestors, so the ancestors, the connection to the land is very important. It was part of his spirituality. And Kemani Nahushi, who is from Guyana as well, who now lives in the US, Temple University professor, teaches African civilization, wrote about the African personality. Talk about that's very important, understanding who the African personality and identity. The African connection with his ancestors was quintessentially important to that used to be one of my favorite words back in the days, quintessentially. I decided to invoke it again because it was so important. I couldn't find any other word. Quintessentially important to reviving his center and accepting and moving from that center to becoming and being and adapting the other cultural characteristics, ethical values, guide moral behavior, and the divine is seen as central to the meaning of life. Spirituality is very important to the African in terms, and even his outlook, how the attitude of the character, his movement, his drives, the rhythm and the movement, very spiritual. Even in the soul song, there's still this connection. Even when you go to the drummings, there's still this rhythm and drumming, moving to the rhythm of the cosmos, being one with the earth, and have music that helps to drive home that family and community. And by the way, in Jamaican revivalism, the ancestral worship is very important. And it's not necessarily ancestral worship in terms of praying to one's ancestors, revering one's ancestors. That was very important. And they bury their ancestors and the name, and that's why it was their connection to the land was so important and was part of their spirituality. Family and community. Jamaican revivalism has that kind of ancestral worship, or whether believing that the angels are among us or the angels come from God. That's part of the types of Jamaican revivalism, which believing that ancestors become angels. It's quite interesting and how that version of it is bound up in various religions today. Secondly, is family and community. The extended family and community are foundational to African societies. there's a strong sense of responsibility to one another, with collective identity and shared responsibility being key elements. In some African societies, you have nuclear families, extended families, or a village family like the village. Okay, but not that they cohabitate, because Edith Clark, who wrote My Mother Who Fathered Me, got it wrong when she made certain pronouncements, but she was not being Afrocentric, she was being Eurocentric in trying to explain Black Caribbean behavior. She was adopting European sociological approach to say that the reason why people in certain communities in Jamaica and the Caribbean, they say shack up or cohabit, is because that's how they behave in parts of Africa. That's not true. That's not true. That is the idea. That is how Black people behave. That's the Africa that's the Black attitude that was created by Europeans. Okay. To provide the narrative. But no, that's not true. That is not okay, because Africans had a sense of family and community. So Caribbean sociologists who were writing in the 1960s and 70s were writing not from an Afrocentric point of view or perspective, but they were being Eurocentric and pessimistic and wrong. Third thing is history and tradition. African cultures place a high value on the preservation of history and traditions. Oral storytelling, rituals, and symbols pass down ancestral wisdom, ensuring that each generation remains connected to its past. Some of our Caribbean religions that we have inherited from Europe don't embrace this kind of symbolism passed down through ancestral wisdom and so on. And all they don't embrace that at all. The fourth one is creative production, creativity and artistic. You know how music and rhythm and dance, such as music, dance, literature, visual arts, play an essential role in the cultural life of African societies, including Caribbean societies. Art is often integrated into everyday life and serve spiritual and communal purposes. Dr. Kimani Nehushi would talk about, say, for example, classical music. People talk about high music. People talk about high music, only classical music. When when the classics was invented by the Africans, by African tradition, that's what they had, high music. Fifth, social structure. But now it's as if the classics has become synonymous with that which is white. Not true. Social structure and governance. African societies traditionally emphasize communal governance. Notice the word communal. What kind of political system or governance embraces a communal type that we know of today? Within the Western world will be like communism or socialism. Yes? And that is why many feminist Marxists, Black nationalists embrace a kind of political system that was communist or socialist. Because, if you look at Karenga, one of the 7 characteristics includes a kind of, in terms of governance and structure, one that they emphasize communal governance with decisions made for the collective good. Leadership is based on wisdom, respect, and service to the community. Edward Siaga, Michael Mann, and many, and in the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of fight in the Caribbean. In the 40s, in fact, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, there was this drive in the Caribbean. Some countries were advocating for a kind of nationalist movement built on communism or socialism. Today, most Caribbean islands have a mixed economies, not necessarily state-run economies, but many of the economies are controlled by external pressures. So there's little that they can do anyways, without political will and strategy, which we seem to continue to lack because we continue to rely heavily on the external forces of the superpower, China or Russia, or China or the US or Britain. We have not learned how to become independent like that of Singapore. Sixth is respect for nature. There is a deep respect for nature. Deep, reflected in the belief that humans are part of the natural world and must live in harmony with it. Their approach and how they treat it. Traditional practices often involve sustainable ways of interacting with the environment. And finally, resilience and resistance. Part of the political tradition of Africans fighting for liberation included people like Nanny of the Maroons and Paul Bogle in Jamaica. But Dana Remy Berry, who wrote Price for a Pound of Flesh, also writes about the transatlantic in her book, Price for Her Pound of Flesh, about the resilience of the slave woman, the indomitability of the African, to preserve his history in culture, family, and identity despite the odds. African cultures have a history of resilience and resistance in the face of adversity, whether in resisting colonization, slavery, or other forms of oppression. These characteristics highlights the importance of struggle and self-determination in African history. And so as I end the class, in closing, these 7 characteristics are vital in understanding how African cultures, including that which extends from it in the Caribbean, in the Americas, and wherever we are all over the world, are distinct yet unified through shared values and practices. Although in Jamaica we still have in the books that obia is illegal and have a have allowed a mischaracterization and classification of it to run wild because we continue to embrace and are married to a particular thing. Anyways, Karenga's work emphasizes the importance of these principles in reconstructing African identities in the diaspora as well. African people are to see themselves in the world as subjects, not as objects. Again, African people are to see themselves in the world as subjects, not as objects. Not subjects of men, but subjects of the world. The Afrocentric paradigm deals with the question of African identity from the perspective of African people. The argument is that African thought should be centered. This is very important. The argument is that African thought should be centered, located, oriented, and grounded within the African way of life. And that is what we are seeking to do in Caribbean thought, a Caribbean that is heavily influenced by a people of the African way. And of course, you have the Indians who say that no, we are the Indian, we are Indians. And then of course there are those Chinese people who say, well, what about China? The argument is that African thought should be centered, located, oriented, and grounded within the African way of life. Because Africa has been largely misunderstood. India has not. China has not. China and India has largely preserved their cultures. Yet China has also served to disrupt the cultures there. But the African culture has been disrupted. African people live in huts. It is not true. Have we gone to Africa to see this? Afrocentricity helps to dismiss these notions and provides a grounding and consciousness. Black nationalism as a political strategy to counter racism is important. Once you admit that race and racism are real, especially in a political sense, it becomes clear that racism is still very much present and white supremacy is still in effect. Denying it is not productive. Denying it is not productive. African American nationalists, and by African American, I'm not just talking about African American in the sense in American mainland, but all of America in the New World. African American nationalists have taken the lead in developing African models for the US, like Kwanzaa, driven by West Indian intellectuals beginning in the early part of the 1900s. African celebrations for African people. Frances White, an African-American female historian who said, dominant negative images of Africa have justified Black enslavement, segregation, and impoverishment. That's why Black nationalism emphasizes the connection African Americans must maintain with Africa. Without that connection, we become easy victims of the racist discourse fed to us in the nature of education. The religious aspect of Black nationalism in the 60s had two threads. The Christian thread, like the shrine of the Black Madonna in Atlanta, which I had the fortune to visit. They believe God is Black, Christianity is African, and they are distinct from white Christians. The Islamic thread, so no, let me say that again. The religious aspect of Black nationalism in the 60s had two threads. The Christian thread, like the shrine of the Black Madonna in Atlanta, which I had the fortune to visit. They believe God is Black. Christianity is of they believe that God is Black. Christianity is African. And they are distinct from white Christians. The Islamic thread was best represented by the Nation of Islam, where God is Black, the devil is white, and so on. There's always been this effort to bring things back to us as Black people. That's why Black nationalism talks about a Black nation, a Black God, and reversing things that have traditionally been viewed through a white lens so as to raise the identity and consciousness of Africans and people in the world about Africa as a collective from the beginning of time. Time that was made possible for Africa and by Africa themselves. Because it is said that it was in Africa that time was invented. Okay, that's it for class today. We will end there. Next week we will continue. We will define critical thinking. We will define post-colonial theory. We will define neoliberalism and begin to look at the book Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance. I will, and at some point I will talk about the Black Kings of the 25th dynasty, but not now. That's for later on. But we'll move on from this to now looking at the issue of life and debt. Hopefully we get the chance to watch the film Life and Debt and delving into the text Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, and Poverty and Resistance, and how over the years that Black people have always been a trouble for white people. And just so you know, there's never always been a white and Black. There's always, the idea of race was never a thing. It became a thing, but I am very intrigued by what's going on in the world today. And I hope that as a people, as a Caribbean people, we are not thermometers, but we are thermostats who are actively engaged in contributing to information and learning from past so that we can better the future. Because it is only by doing so that we can get ahead. Because the world is a world of strategy. And part of this course is not just to be exposed to information where you can sit and pass an exam, but is to develop a cadre of students who are exposed to cutting-edge information that will help to facilitate the development of a Caribbean that is based in strategy Strategies that they understand have come to beguile them, but they have learned to navigate because they have been exposed to the information. All right. I pray that God will continue to bless you and keep you. And before I end the class, I ask any questions, any concerns. Any questions?
Sir,
Yes.
Julian here. I have two points. That point that you raised about how quickly we dismissed the whole notion of the legalizing obeah in Jamaica. While I was thinking about it, based on how we are cultured, obeah is viewed as, and based on what we have experienced as well, it's viewed as something negative and evil. So I would be one who would be quick to be against it becoming legal in our country. So I felt like you probably should explain that a little more. Why shouldn't we be why shouldn't we see it as something negative?
Well, what I would like you two guys to do is to do the survey. There's a survey on JTS online that explores the changing attitudes towards Afro-Caribbean traditions and beliefs in Jamaica. I want to know what's your opinion, and we're going to probably, not next week, but the class after that, we'll have a discussion or a debate that looks and confront these issues. Why it is that we are opposed to the legalization of obeah even to today, when we know all that we know. Nanny of the Maroons we hail as a hero was an obeah woman. Dottie Bookman was an obeah man. What we know is that the thing is, there are those who have, we know that many people, the same Bible that we use, have used to justify slavery, yet we still embrace it. We have been so wired to denounce anything that is African. Donald Trump can commit a crime and we can still vote for him to be president. But as soon as Obama gets into office and roll up his sleeve, it's a problem. I mean, that is simply putting the point, but obeah is part of a traditional spiritual religion that involves healing, praying to our ancestors for strength to overcome the evil one. It was what our ancestors, our heroes used to fight the white slave masters, and the Maroons were victorious. Okay. But then they have come to corrupt it. Okay, we live, I said to you, if you go to institutions, the institutions that we go to are Eurocentric, European. Obeah is African. We have African heritage, but our institutions are European. And we live in a competitive world that has denigrated the African. If you know this, then the question that you ask is easily answered as an African yourself.
With all due respect, sir, you've actually made the thing more complicated, because with everything that you just said, it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe I am looking too deep into it, but what you just said does not explain why we should not believe that obeah is wrong and should not be
I am
legal in
saying to
Jamaica.
you, do you know the issue of abuse? What is abuse?
Sir,
What is abuse?
abuse is when you take advantage take advantage of a particular power over a particular thing. So yes, persons abuse obeah. I understand what you're saying. However,
Abuse
if you're
is to
gonna go,
use something for what it is not intended for. There are those who have sought to corrupt the identity of the purity of a thing. Nothing black, no good. even our religion and have made it evil. That same religion is what our ancestors have used to. Then the Europeans in 1882 did not like the fact that they were praying and drawing strength from from our African traditions and coming together and praying. They didn't like how then they were afraid of the Obeah people who were fighting them and you calling on, and they were saying, oh, they could pray and on just as how we can pray and say, God, my mom and dad used to pray and say, sick them, Jesus, sick them, and God has come and wash them away. That come from African tradition, where they would pray and say, for my ancestors to give them strength, or herb and spices for healing, for strength and for protection. And for those who sought to tear them down, we pray and ask the ancestors to prevent them from hurting us. That is the same thing that, I mean, I'm saying to you, that is the idea of voodoo. And this is not the class for it because I have a whole lecture for voodoo. Okay. And we're going to have somebody come and talk about African tradition and spirituality to talk to you some more about it. I mean, I can talk to you some more about it, but what I'm saying to you is
because
people
sir,
have to corrupt the purity of a thing. That's what power is. They say Africa is primitive. Now we're learning that Africa was civilized. Okay? What I'm saying to you, how can you now say, if you know that there are those we live in a culture that have demeaned, that have redefined a thing for what it is not in order to control it, to dominate it, will you, the African, continue to hold on to the idea that was sold to you by the European? Because obeah was illegalized in 1882. We weren't running the show, we were slaves. Oh, well, no, we weren't really slaves in 1882, but we were still
sir,
subjects. Yes.
Because of like the Caribbean 80, voodoo is the number one religion in 80. And when I look at what is happening in 80,
not necessarily.
It doesn't encourage me to embrace.
Yeah, I know. And there are those who say that what's going on in Haiti, there are Jamaicans who say what's going on in Haiti today is because of voodoo. It's quite an unfortunate statement because they don't know what voodoo is.
So, sir, as a reverend, you're saying that one should be okay with praying to the ancestor, even though the Bible tells you that the living has no power with the dead?
What I am saying to you, I'm not telling you should say one thing or another. What I'm saying is to you is this, that we have been institutionalized by our slave masters to adopt their religion over ours.
So we're not talking about that now,
let me finish. And we have done that, and to the point where we are left apoplectic, we don't even know what to do. Okay? And I'm saying to you, but I have an answer for you, but I won't answer your question yet. Okay? I have an answer for you, because I used to teach apologetics, which is the use of logic to defend the faith. Because you're asking me a question, oh, shall we now pray to the... my mom just died, and you know what I say to my mom? I say, God, I said, Mom, I know you're talking to God on my behalf. Oh, my mom just talked to God and that came. You guys don't do that?
Yes, sir, we do.
Okay. That came from a genetic code that's deep within us. Okay. We will talk more about this. We will do a lecture on
yes, sir, we have to.
I have another lecture. We're out of time. But
before you go, sir, I wanted to ask about the book, the Neurobalism book that you wrote. Sir, can I get a hard copy? I texted in the group, but no response. Where can I get a hard copy of the book, sir?
Amazon, or text Chantel, and I'll ship one out. I'll ship one out to you if you go to the neoliberal store at theneoliberal.com.
Because I wasn't able to do that assignment based on just the prefix. I wrote something, but it was not very I couldn't interact with the assignment based on the little limited reading that we got with the preface.
Listen, guys, the book is available. The book is available in the library. It's available on every bookstore worldwide. It's everywhere. So, it's an ebook, paperback, and it is somewhere
Sir,
else. And guess what?
I'm
It is
gonna
right.
talk to
Wait,
Chantal
wait,
and
wait,
see
wait,
if she
wait.
can,
It
because
is right at your fingertips, and you don't even know. I deliberately not even gonna tell you anything else. I did it to see if you guys are really attuned to stuff.
sir, I went online.
Entire
I went online.
Well, I mean, I know. I mean, it's somewhere, probably at JTS Online, the entire manuscript, which I took the time out to share because I'm tired of people saying they can't find it. And I put the whole thing on JTS Online on the Caribbean thought. Maybe it's there if you look. We end
I
class today,
did.
guys. We end, guys. I should not have said that. We end now that you guys not going to try and buy the book, but we end, guys. And if you can find this book, try and get it. They came before. They came before Columbus. Okay.
They
Great
came
class.
before Columbus.
They came before
Okay.
Columbus by Ivan van Sertima. That one you have to buy. My book, I think you should buy my book. I wrote the book with
I think so too, sir. But
yeah,
I'm gonna talk to Chantal. So, sir,
and
you give
book
us a chance with that assignment because we didn't have the book yet.
yeah, because I haven't discussed it yet. I will discuss that part next week. So
Okay, sir.
good.
Thanks.
You're
Yeah.
still in the good waters because I haven't discussed the neoliberalism yet. We're moving there now. We're moving there. But we're beginning with the foundation. First, we're talking, have we misunderstood our history? Where do we begin? Where do we begin with the study of Caribbean? First, we have to center and orient our thought. Okay? And that's what I did. But it's like an ant's nest. Just as though I was in an ant's nest. Okay? All right. God bless you guys. Have a great weekend. May you be inspired. God, inspire these students in such a profound way, and may they inspire others. Grant them favor, and let them come back to class next Friday with a testimony of the favor that you granted them. And as you grant them favor, may you put them in a position to allow them to grant others favor. Strengthen their families, open up their minds. Help me to be able to facilitate this class in the way that will help to develop their understanding and to grow them. Help me to be true to what you want me to do in their lives. Lord God, and help us to grow and to develop and to be strong and to maintain a very good relationship as a class, even beyond the program here. Touch the students in their work, in their career, even now in their finances. I pray that you bless them financially, because you know what? They're not selfish. They want to use their finances to develop, to buy books. Many of them are involved in their churches, and their churches is very involved in the community, and they use it, Lord God, to empower. So bless them so that they are able to bless their loved ones, bless their churches to do the work that they need to do, Lord God, and they can continue to come to JTS and pay their tuition and do well. Bless them, help them to walk into a love offering today, a special gift. Let somebody at church, the family say, hey, you at JTS, you're studying. Oh, I'm so proud of you. Here's $10,000. Here's $20,000. Here's $100,000. May God bless them. May somebody walk into a special love offering today, God. I'm praying that somebody needs it even now. Somebody is concerned about how they're gonna pay, if they're gonna be able to continue with this course, with this program. I come against doubt. I pray that if they're thinking that, Lord God, that you will even now meet them at the point of their need. If anybody is going through whatever, let them know that they are fine. They will be fine, oh God. Bless us to be able to bless them. Bless their finances. Those who are hurting, those who might have physical ailment, we pray that you heal them even now, oh God. Wherever they are, heal them in the name of Jesus. I'm using the word Jesus, but I know, Lord God, you are bigger than any name, any 5-letter name I can call. You are than that which nothing greater can be conceived or ever imagined. You are unlimited, but we are limited. But you use the limitations of man to make sense of the divine, because you understand that we are mere human. And so we thank you for your understanding and with the limitations that you have made us, and to watch us navigate and grow up. Help us to love one another wherever we are in our journeys in life. Keep us safe. Touch our psyche. Bring balance to the world and bring love to humanity. Amen. God bless you guys. Take care.
Bless you too, sir. Good evening. Good evening, everyone.